I've always liked the quiet of the wilderness. Something about being away from the noise of the world, surrounded by trees, the air crisp and clean. It's always felt like a break from everything. I've been camping since I was young, and over the years I've gotten used to the solitude that comes with it. But there was one trip that changed how I looked at the woods forever. It was late September, a time when the air had a sharp bite to it, but the days were still warm enough to make a trip into the forest worthwhile. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend a few nights deep in the woods of northern Montana. I picked a spot I had camped in once before, a stretch of forestland miles away from any main roads or trails. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for days. That was part of the appeal. I packed my truck with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food and water to last me a while. My rifle was slung across the back seat, along with a hunting knife strapped to my belt. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I never went that deep into the woods unarmed. Not because of wild animals, though those could be a problem, but because when you're that far from civilization, you don't take chances. The drive out was long, the roads turning from pavement to gravel to dirt, the trees growing thicker with each mile. The last stretch was nothing more than a narrow trail barely wide enough for my truck. I had to keep my windows down, listening for anything ahead that I might not see through the thick brush. By the time I reached my chosen site, the sun was already dipping low. I wasted no time setting up camp. I pitched my tent between two thick pines, giving myself enough coverage from the wind while still being able to see the clearing around me. My fire was small but steady, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence of the woods. The first night was uneventful. The air was cool, the stars clear overhead, and aside from the occasional rustle in the trees from a passing animal, there was nothing to put me on edge. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had spent the day hiking through the woods, taking in the scenery, following old deer trails and marking my path with bright orange tape. I knew these woods well, but I never took risks. The last thing I wanted was to get turned around with no way back. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set. I set up a small fire and heated up some food, the sound of the flames flickering the only noise in the otherwise silent woods. It was quiet, too quiet, even for this deep in the wilderness. Normally, you hear things at night: insects buzzing, the distant call of an owl, the occasional scurry of something moving through the underbrush. But that night, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crackling of the fire. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But then I noticed something strange. The forest smelled different. When you're in the woods long enough, you start to recognize the natural scents: the damp earth, the pine, the distant musk of an animal. But this was something else, something unnatural. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the smoke of the fire. But as the night stretched on, it grew stronger. It smelled like metal, like rust, like blood. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the trunks of trees and casting long shadows. I didn't see anything. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me. Just trees. Still, the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I took my rifle and rested it across my lap, keeping my ears open for anything unusual. But nothing came. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I barely slept that night, every small sound snapping me awake. When dawn finally broke, I felt a sense of relief. The feeling from the night before was still fresh in my mind, but in the daylight, it was easier to ignore. I spent most of the morning walking the perimeter of my camp, looking for any signs that something or someone had been nearby. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No signs of anything out of the ordinary. By midday, I convinced myself I had overreacted. I went about my day as usual, hiking further into the woods and making note of anything worth returning to. But as the sun dipped lower, the uneasy feeling from the night before started creeping back. That evening, I kept my fire going longer than usual, the light flickering against the trees. I sat with my back to my tent, rifle across my lap, my ears straining for any sound out of place. And then I heard it, a low, steady crunch of leaves. Footsteps. I held my breath, my grip tightening around my rifle. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the tree line. I lifted my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stayed still, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire crackled beside me, the only source of light in the darkness. And then a branch snapped, closer this time. I didn't hesitate. I lifted my rifle, aiming into the trees, my finger resting on the trigger. I wasn't gonna fire unless I had to, but I wasn't about to sit there like an easy target either. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, just when I thought maybe I had imagined it all, something moved, a dark shape, barely visible against the blackness of the forest. It was too far to make out any details, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't an animal. The figure stood just beyond the reach of my flashlight, unmoving, watching. I didn't call out. I didn't lower my rifle. I just kept my eyes locked on that spot, my muscles tense. Minutes passed. Then, without a sound, the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my rifle in my hands until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. And the moment the sun was up, I packed my things. I didn't take my time. I threw my gear into the truck, making sure I left nothing behind. I didn't look back as I drove away, the trees closing in around the narrow road. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whoever it was, they were watching me. I used to love camping. It was something I did every chance I got, just to get away from everything for a while. No noise, no stress, just me, my gear, and the woods. But one trip changed the way I saw the outdoors forever. It was the summer of 2017. I had taken a week off work and decided to camp alone in a national forest in Montana. I had been to that area before, and I liked it because it was quiet, far from the more crowded spots. There were no designated campsites, just miles of forest with a few dirt roads winding through it. If you wanted to camp, you just found a clearing, set up your tent, and that was it. I had packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some food, a basic cooking setup, and my rifle. I always brought a gun when I camped alone. I never needed to use it, but it gave me peace of mind. I drove deep into the woods, miles away from the last sign of civilization, and found a spot near a small creek. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of trees for cover, and the sound of running water to drown out any little noises that might keep me awake. The first night was peaceful. I built a fire, cooked some food, and sat there just listening to the woods. There was nothing unusual, just the sounds of crickets, owls, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush from some small animal. The second day, I decided to explore. I spent hours hiking, following the creek, and enjoying the quiet. I found some old animal tracks, probably a deer, and even saw a black bear from a distance. It wasn't close enough to be a problem, but it was a reminder to keep my food stored properly. That night, things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, eating, when I heard something moving in the trees. It wasn't just the sound of an animal passing through. It was slow, deliberate. I shined my flashlight toward the noise, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or something, but my gut told me otherwise. Something about the way it moved wasn't right. It was too quiet, too careful. Animals don't usually act like that unless they're stalking something. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound outside my tent made me jump. I kept my rifle close just in case. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. There were no tracks, nothing to show that anything had been there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I had camped alone dozens of times before, and nothing had ever happened. So I stayed. That day, I decided to hike up a nearby ridge. I wanted a better view of the area to see if there were any good fishing spots along the creek. It took a couple of hours, but when I reached the top, I had a clear view for miles. That's when I saw it. Down near my campsite, in the trees, there was movement. Someone was walking through the woods near my tent. I froze. I was miles from the nearest road. No one should have been out there. I watched for a few minutes, trying to get a better look, but whoever it was disappeared into the trees. I hurried back down. When I got to my campsite, everything looked the same. My gear was untouched. My food was still hanging in the tree where I had left it. There was no sign that anyone had been there, but I knew what I saw. That night, I made sure my fire was big and bright. If someone was out there, I wanted them to know I was awake. I kept my rifle in my lap as I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. A few hours passed, and nothing happened. No sounds, no movement. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it, that the figure I saw was just a trick of the light. I went into my tent and tried to sleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The woods were completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Right outside my tent. I reached for my rifle, moving as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, not breathing, waiting. Then the side of my tent moved. Something or someone was touching it, running a hand along the fabric. I ripped open the tent and raised my rifle. Nothing. The fire cast just enough light for me to see a few feet in front of me. But beyond that, only darkness. I stood there, scanning the trees, listening. The woods were still silent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, rifle in my hands, waiting for the sun to come up. As soon as it did, I packed my gear and left. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But I never saw anyone. When I got back to town, I stopped at a small general store to grab some food before heading home. The guy at the counter noticed my gear and asked if I had been camping. I told him I had, and he asked where. When I told him, his expression changed. "That's deep in the woods," he said. "Not many people go out there." I nodded. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Couple years back, a guy went missing out there. Never found him, just his campsite. Everything was still there, his tent, his gear, but he was gone. I never went camping alone again. I had always been someone who loved the quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you when you were deep in the woods, away from people, from cities, from the constant hum of life. That was why I had come to France in the first place, to get away, to disconnect, to lose myself in nature for a little while. I wasn't a tourist looking for famous landmarks or fancy hotels. I wanted the solitude, the rawness of the wilderness, the kind that didn't come with safety nets or backup plans. It was late September, just on the edge of autumn, and the forests of southeastern France were exactly what I had been looking for. I had spent a few days driving through the countryside, stopping in small villages for supplies, and heading deeper into the wild with each passing night. Eventually, I found a remote stretch of land near the Rhone Alpes, dense with trees mostly untouched. I parked my rental car off a narrow dirt road, far from any major paths, and hiked about an hour into the woods before setting up camp. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The nearest town was miles away, and as far as I could tell, there wasn't another soul around. It was perfect. The first few nights passed in peace. I spent my days hiking, taking in the beauty of the untouched land, and my nights by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to feel off. It was late, probably around midnight, when I first noticed it. The feeling. It wasn't anything obvious. No sudden noises or movements in the trees, but something in the air had shifted. The woods didn't feel as welcoming as they had before. The sounds of the forest had changed, too. The usual hum of insects and rustling leaves seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a result of being alone for too long. But still, I couldn't shake the unease. It sat heavy in my chest, making every small sound seem sharper, more unnatural. Then I heard it, a crunch, not from my camp, but somewhere beyond the trees, just far enough that I couldn't see anything. It wasn't the sound of a small animal either. It was slow, deliberate, the weight of something moving carefully across the forest floor. I stayed still, barely even breathing, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, but I hesitated before turning it on. If there was something out there, someone, I didn't want to make myself a target. Instead, I grabbed the small hunting knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. For nearly an hour, I sat there, unmoving, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The footsteps never got closer, never moved away. They just stopped. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I forced myself to lie down, gripping my knife tightly until sleep finally came. The next morning, I woke up to find the forest the same as it had always been. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds called out from the branches, and for a brief moment, I felt foolish for letting my nerves get the best of me. Maybe it had just been an animal, something passing through the night. But then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, half covered by fallen leaves. But they were there. Human footprints leading from the trees toward my campsite. They stopped just a few feet away from where I had been sleeping. Then, just like last night, they disappeared. Someone had been there, watching. I packed up my things as fast as I could. I told myself I wasn't scared, just cautious. I had no idea who might be out here, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I had been careful to camp far from any known trails, which meant that whoever had been in my camp wasn't just a lost hiker. They had been looking for something. For me, I hiked for hours that day, deeper into the woods, putting as much distance between myself and my old campsite as I could. When I finally set up camp again, I made sure to stay in a more concealed spot, hidden between thick trees. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I barely slept. Every noise put me on edge. Every shifting shadow sent my heart racing. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, but nothing happened. Morning came, and for a while it seemed like everything was fine. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it had just been some local hunter passing through. But then, I found something that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of my camp, carved into the bark of a tree, was a symbol. A crude, rough carving, almost like a warning. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it hadn't been there the night before. Someone was following me. I didn't waste any time packing up. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I just needed to get back to my car, back to civilization. The hike back was brutal. My legs ached. My body screamed for rest, but I didn't stop. Every so often, I caught glimpses of something in the distance. A shape moving through the trees, never close enough to see clearly, but always there. I picked up my pace, practically running by the time I got close to where I had left my car. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. But when I finally reached the dirt road, my stomach dropped. My car was gone. The spot where I had parked was empty, the ground disturbed by tire tracks leading away. Someone had taken it. Someone had made sure I had no way out. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest town, alone in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. I had my supplies, my knife, but none of it mattered if I couldn't get out of here. I turned back toward the woods, trying to think, trying to breathe. That was when I saw them, a figure standing at the tree line, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. Then, without a sound, they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. My body screamed for rest. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Eventually, I reached a road. A real road, and then, by some miracle, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms, screaming. The truck slowed. The driver, an older man, looking at me with confusion and concern. I told him I needed help, that I had been out in the woods and lost my car. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't have the words, but he let me in, took me to the nearest town. I never went back. I never tried to find out who had been out there, who had been watching me, who had taken my car. The police found it abandoned a few days later, deep in the woods, far from where I had left it. No sign of who had taken it. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. But I know one thing for certain. I was never supposed to leave those woods alive. I don't like talking about this. I don't even like thinking about it. But some things stay with you whether you want them to or not. No matter how much I try to push it away, it finds its way back. The way the night smelled, the way the cold crept into my bones, the way my stomach twisted when I realized I wasn't alone. It happened in 2017. I was 26 back then, young enough to still think nothing bad could happen to me, but old enough to have seen things that made me wary of the world. I had spent the last few years moving around, working construction jobs, never really settling down. I didn't have much, just a truck, some gear, and a restless feeling that kept me from staying in one place too long. That year, I was working a job in Arizona, near the New Mexico border. The work was good, but the town was small, nothing to do after dark. I had a couple of days off, and I figured I'd go out into the wilderness, set up camp, get away from people for a bit. I'd always liked being out in nature. It made me feel calm, like the world made more sense out there. I picked a spot deep in the woods, a few hours from town. A place I found on a map that looked far enough from civilization that I wouldn't see another person the whole time. I packed my truck, drove out there, and set up camp near a small clearing. I had a tent, a fire pit, some supplies. Nothing fancy. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual sounds of the forest. Crickets, the wind through the trees, a few distant howls from coyotes. I sat by the fire, cooked some food, and stared up at the sky. The stars were clear, bright. It was peaceful. I felt good about being out there. The second night was different. It started with a sound. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire when I heard something in the trees. A rustling noise, like something moving through the brush. I wasn't worried at first. Animals move around at night. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something felt off. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't the careless noise of an animal wandering through the undergrowth. It was slow, deliberate, like something was trying to be quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the beam. The fire crackled behind me, sending flickering shadows across the trunks. I told myself it was nothing, but I still felt uneasy. My skin tingled like I was being watched. I forced myself to ignore it, threw another log on the fire, and tried to shake it off. Then I heard it again. Closer. A branch snapped, not far from where I was sitting. My stomach clenched. That wasn't a deer. That wasn't a raccoon. That was something heavy, something on two legs. I stood up slowly, shining the flashlight around. I scanned the trees, moving the beam back and forth, but all I saw were shadows. The fire popped behind me. The night felt colder. I took a deep breath and spoke into the dark. Nothing, not even the sound of something running off. That was what got me. If it had been an animal, it would have bolted when I made a noise. But whatever this was, it was still out there, watching. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. My gut was telling me something was wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, listening for sounds outside my tent. Every time the wind moved the branches, I tensed up, waiting for something else. But nothing happened. Not until the third night. I should have left. My instincts were screaming at me to pack up and go. But I didn't want to be that guy. The guy who gets spooked by nothing and runs off. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head. I set up a bigger fire that night. Something about the flames made me feel safer, like whatever was out there wouldn't come too close. But then, around midnight, I heard it again. Closer this time. Footsteps. Not the quiet, careful steps from the night before. These were slow, heavy, right outside the ring of firelight. I stood up, my flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I scanned the trees. Then I saw it. A shape, tall, too tall, standing just at the edge of the light. First, I thought it was a man, but something was wrong. Its limbs were too long. His posture was off. The way it stood wasn't natural. I aimed the flashlight at it, and then it moved, not like a person, not like anything I had ever seen before. It shifted, its body twisting in a way that made my stomach turn. And then it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing like it had never been there. I don't remember moving. I don't remember making the decision to grab my keys and jump in my truck. One moment I was standing by the fire, staring into the dark, and the next I was peeling out of that clearing, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow trail. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back for my tent, my gear, nothing. The next day, I drove into town, went straight to a gas station, and sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. My hands were still shaking. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was watching me, it wasn't human, and it didn't want me there. I've always liked the idea of camping alone. There's something peaceful about it. No distractions, no noise, just me and the sounds of nature. It started when I was younger, weekend trips to the forest near my hometown with my dad. Learning how to start a fire, set up a tent, cook over an open flame. Over the years, I got comfortable enough to do it alone. I figured I knew what I was doing. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to take a trip out to a remote part of Washington, deep in the forests near the Olympic National Park. I had been to a few campsites in the area before, but this time I wanted to go further, away from the marked trails, somewhere isolated. I spent the day driving up winding roads, the kind barely wide enough for one car, with thick trees pressing in on both sides. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing just off a dirt path. It was perfect, flat ground, enough space for my tent, and far enough from any main trails that I wouldn't be bothered. I set up my camp the way I always did. Tent staked down tightly, fire pit cleared of debris, food strung up high in a tree to keep it away from animals. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were birds in the distance and the rustling of leaves. I spent the rest of the afternoon collecting firewood, making sure I had enough to last the night. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped, and I got the fire going. The crackling flames were the only source of light in the darkening woods. I ate a simple meal, canned soup and some bread, then leaned back against a log, enjoying the quiet. It was around that time that I noticed something, a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a branch snapping. Close, too close. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkened tree line. Nothing, just the flickering firelight making shadows dance. My brain tried to rationalize it. Probably an animal, a deer maybe. I shook it off and focused on the fire. But then, another sound, leaves crunching. This time, it wasn't a single step. It was a few, like something was moving. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were more trees, more bushes, nothing out of place. I stayed still for a while, listening. The fire popped behind me, but nothing else moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to my seat. Hours passed. The fire burned lower, and the night stretched on. Every so often, I thought I heard something, but it was always distant, probably my mind playing tricks on me. I finally decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, making sure every ember was out, then climbed into my tent. The air was cold now, and the silence outside felt heavier. I zipped up my sleeping bag and lay there, listening. Then, around 2 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Breathing, not mine. It was close, right outside the tent. Slow, deep. I froze. Every part of me screamed to stay still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whatever, was out there would hear it. I strained to listen, barely breathing myself. The sound moved, shifting slightly, like someone adjusting their weight. I could feel it. Something was right there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I thought about unzipping the tent, jumping out, but I didn't want to, because if I did, I would see it. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I stayed still. The breathing eventually faded, the footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't move until the sky started to lighten. When I finally unzipped the tent, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, not animal tracks, human, large, barefoot. They circled my campsite, stopped inches from my tent. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't bother cleaning up. I threw everything into my pack and started the hike back to my car. The entire way I felt watched. I didn't hear anything else, didn't see anyone, but I knew something had been out there with me. I never camped alone again. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being out in the quiet, away from the noise of people, cars, and the artificial hum of city life that felt right to me. I wasn't some survival expert, but I knew my way around the woods. I could build a fire, set up a tent, and read a map. I liked the stillness, the isolation. It felt like the only time I could really think. That's why, one summer, I decided to head out to a quiet stretch of countryside I had camped in before. It was far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't run into other campers, but not so remote that I couldn't hike back to civilization if I needed to. I packed my gear, filled my truck with supplies, and made my way out there in the late afternoon. The drive took about 2 hours, the last stretch being a narrow dirt road cutting through a dense patch of trees. My campsite was in a clearing near a slow-moving river. I had found it a year before when exploring the area, and it was perfect. Flat ground, close to water, and far from any trails. When I arrived, I got to work setting up my tent and getting everything in place before dark. The air smelled fresh, the trees thick and unmoving in the heat of the day. I laid out my sleeping bag, stacked some firewood, and cracked open a cold drink as the sun started to dip below the trees. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. It was supposed to be like all my other camping trips. Quiet, peaceful. But by the time the sun fully set, something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the woods settling. Twigs snapping in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I sat by the fire, staring into the dark, I got that feeling. The kind that creeps up on you when you realize you might not be as alone as you thought. I told myself I was just on edge. Maybe I had been working too much. My mind too used to being surrounded by people, and now it was struggling with the silence. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard something. Not an animal, not the wind, a sound that made my stomach twist. Footsteps. They weren't loud, they weren't close, but they were there. Slow, deliberate, not the frantic scurrying of a deer or the light patter of a raccoon. These were heavy, even. I sat still, listening. The fire crackled beside me, its light only reaching so far. Beyond that, the woods were black. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks. I had been alone too long. My brain was looking for patterns in the silence, making something out of nothing. I let it go. The rest of the night was uneventful. I ate, sat by the fire, and eventually crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. I listened for a while before sleep took me. No more footsteps, just the wind. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, stretching, breathing in the cold air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, weaving between the trees, stopping just a few feet from my tent before retreating back into the woods. I stood frozen, my mind racing. I had camped alone plenty of times. I had never run into another person out here. No one should have been anywhere near me. I bent down, inspecting them closer. They were fresh. The dirt was still damp around the edges, pressed deep like someone had been walking slow and heavy. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone. But I knew what I saw. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me. The thought made my skin crawl. I could have packed up right then and there, but I told myself it was probably some hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my tent, got curious, and then left. No harm done. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been there too long, that they had gotten too close. I spent the day trying to put it out of my mind. I went on a short hike, gathered more wood, tried to enjoy being out there. By the time the sun started setting, I had almost convinced myself I was overreacting. But that night, I woke up to something worse. I wasn't sure what pulled me from sleep at first. The fire was low outside, casting long shadows against the walls of my tent. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, deep, close, right outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fabric of the tent was thin, but I couldn't see outside. I could only hear the soft, deliberate inhale, the quiet exhale. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping it tight. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't. I felt like a deer caught in headlights, frozen, waiting for whatever was out there to make the next move. Then a single step, right next to the tent. I almost stopped breathing entirely. Whoever it was, they were standing just inches from me, only a thin layer of fabric between us. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle tense. I listened, waiting, heart hammering so loud I swore they could hear it. Then nothing. The breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and steady, fading into the woods. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally moved. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. The footprints were back. More of them, leading to my tent, circling it, then vanishing into the dark. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I packed up as soon as the sun was up. I didn't care how far I had to hike back to my truck. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my gear, I noticed something near the tree line, a piece of fabric, tangled in the undergrowth. I walked over, hesitant, stomach knotting as I picked it up. It was a shirt, dirty, torn, too large for me. And then I saw the knife, old, rusted, half buried in the dirt. Someone had been out here, watching, waiting. I didn't think twice after that. I threw the last of my gear into the truck and got out of there, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the dirt road. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I was never really alone. I had always loved the quiet that came with being out in nature, away from the noise of the city. The sound of the wind moving through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the way the fire crackled at night. It all felt right to me. I was in my late 30s, and over the years I had taken plenty of solo camping trips. This time was no different. I had driven out to a remote part of the woods, deep in a state forest, where I knew few people ever ventured. I had found the spot a couple of years back, tucked away near a river with a clearing just big enough for my tent and a small fire pit. The nearest town was a good 40 miles away, and even then it was nothing more than a gas station, a diner, and a handful of houses. I liked it that way. The forecast had called for rain later in the evening, but I didn't mind. I had packed accordingly. A good waterproof tent, a tarp to cover my firewood, and enough dry gear to last me a few days. By the time I set up camp, the sky was already turning that deep gray that comes before a storm. The air smelled like wet earth, and the wind had started to pick up, rustling the trees around me. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The woods felt eerily silent, as if the animals had already taken shelter for the night. I noticed that the birds, which usually chirped and moved through the trees, were nowhere to be seen. That should have been my first clue. The rain started as a light drizzle around 9, just as I was settling in for the night. I had set up my tent a little way back from the fire, under a thick canopy of trees. It kept most of the rain off, though the occasional drop found its way through. The fire hissed and sputtered, and I watched as the flames shrank under the steady downfall. I sat inside my tent, listening to the rain tap against the fabric. There was something oddly comforting about it, the steady rhythm filling the silence. I should have been relaxed, but something felt off. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as I sat there, I realized it wasn't. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, that deep, instinctual feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. It was faint, barely audible over the rain. A rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. The rain made it hard to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. I slowly reached for my flashlight, keeping my movements as quiet as possible. My heart was pounding now. I wasn't scared yet, but I was alert. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. No one came this deep into the woods, not without a reason. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just the rain-soaked forest, thick with shadows. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something moving through the underbrush. That had to be it. I let out a slow breath and turned off the flashlight. But just as I did, the sound came again. Closer this time. I froze. It wasn't the sound of an animal. Animals move quickly, their steps light. This was different. It was slow, deliberate. A footstep. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. My rifle was outside, leaning against a tree near the fire pit. My knife was inside the tent, but that wouldn't do much against someone who meant harm. I sat completely still, listening. The rain had picked up, making it harder to hear, but I knew what I had heard. Another footstep, then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my ears straining against the sound of the rain. Nothing. No more footsteps, no movement. Eventually, I forced myself to relax. Maybe it had been my imagination after all, a trick of the storm. But I kept my knife close as I lay down, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound had me wide awake, my mind replaying that moment over and over. By the time morning came, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest thick with mist. I unzipped my tent, stretching out my stiff limbs. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet leaves and earth. I stepped outside and froze. There, in the mud just outside my tent, were footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They led from the trees to where my tent was, and then back into the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been here. Someone had stood just outside my tent while I slept. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. No sign of anyone, just those footprints partially washed away by the rain. I packed up fast. I didn't take my time like I usually didn't sit by the fire with a cup of coffee. I wanted to be gone. By the time I reached my truck, the unease was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty, rain-soaked forest. I never went back to that spot again.